In the upcoming interview, I'm interviewing Robert Betty. I wanted to take a look at how faith-based communities are affected by the pandemic. Robert is a practicing Christian. I'm a practicing Muslim. It's Ramadan. So I thought it would be interesting for him and I to just talk about how our different faith communities are dealing with the pandemic and the restrictions in terms of being able to congregate and how that's affecting the community at large. So have a listen and share your thoughts. Thanks so much. All right, today I'm here with my good friend, Robert Betty. And Robert and I have known each other for a few years now. We got acquainted during a federal campaign out in his part of the city. And then we've been friends since, and have had many occasions to talk politics and talk other things. I thought that I would touch base with Robert, us both being men of faith. And I thought it'd be interesting to get a perspective on how religions and faith-based communities are dealing with the pandemic, dealing with the fact that we can't congregate as normal, especially relevant for me because it's Ramadan, and many of the usual practices and customs that I would do during Ramadan, I can't, because I can't go to the mosque, and I can't congregate and get together with my fellow Muslims. I'm sure Robert and his faith has also seen a lot of effects of the restrictions. So we want to talk about that. We'll put it all in context with the pandemic and what's going on. We'll talk about what's happening in the US as well. But all of it in terms of, what are the challenges and how are people of faith and community of faith rising up to the challenge. How's that sound, Robert?
Sounds good. Thanks for inviting me.
You want to give everybody a little bit about yourself and actually, I should preface this, the fact that neither Robert nor I are religious scholars. We do not or will not attempt to, I especially won't interpret any religious doctrine or any faith, deep faith history, etc. Because I'm not a religious scholar. This is all just based on me, myself being a Muslim and a man of faith, and how I am experiencing this pandemic during Ramadan. And I think you would say the same, Robert?
Absolutely. I'm a student of the faith, not a teacher, that's for sure.
We're practitioners and students.
Yeah, exactly.
You want to tell everybody a little bit about yourself, Robert?
Sure. I'm an Edmontonian by birth, lived 55 out of 57 of my years in this fine city, and I grew up in a faith-based family. Had one parent, and my grandmother and my mother and grandmother were both sort of inclined to bring me up in a faith practice. My dad was a late bloomer, I guess we'd say. He's currently on the inside of the tent, as you described it. But I grew up going to Sunday school, attending church, going through all the motions you do as a kid. But like most of us, there comes a time in your life where you've got where hopefully you question, hopefully you go a little deeper and you decide for yourself if this is something that is the truth that you want to build your life around. And that was a difficult and painful process in my late teen years and early 20s. There were times when I would have described myself as a lapsed Christian. And I think that was a healthy process, because I think you can bring a more critical eye to your practice and your belief from the outside than maybe sometimes you can do from when you're inside ascribing to it. So I learned a lot during that period. I made an intentional study of it and came back into a faith practice. Was fortunate enough to meet and fall in love and marry a woman who challenges me in that regularly. I think we're a healthy couple in that we both challenge each other to grow throughout our lives and keep each other honest about our shortcomings and stuff. And so it becomes a long time journey, really, a faith practice. But in terms of my day-to-day life, I'm 33 years now as a manufacturer's agent in the home furnishings business. So I call on small, medium, and large-sized businesses all across Western Canada, and do my best to make a good living and be of good service to those clients and to the manufacturers that I represent. I'm a parent. I have 2 grown children, one in their mid to late 20s. So that's a big part of who I am. And as I said, I'm a husband. Those would be my touchstones. And I suppose if what is it? Is it the Marines that go? What is it? Code, country. I don't know. I don't remember the order that they put them in,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I won't. I will ask you not to ask me to put those in order. But I guess since we're coming from a faith perspective, we should put God first. But and I work hard to do that, but it takes continual, intentional effort to make sure that that's the starting point of my descriptor.
Wow. You know, I've had a similar journey. You know, my mother's always been a devout Muslim, and she tried very hard to instill it in all of her children. You know, making us read the Quran and trying to memorize the Quran and teaching us the prayers, and you know, sending us to our version of Sunday school. And you know, but my father was sort of, you know, more laid back, and you know, he's more modern Muslim. I mean, he was still, you know, a Muslim in every way, but you know, he wasn't as worried about the rituals as my mom was. So we had that bit of a contrast. And so I mean, most of my life, I would say, you know, I was a non-practicing Muslim for most of my life. And then, you know, like you said, you know, things happen in our lives that make us, you know, look more closely at our faith and examine our spirituality, which did happen to me much later in life. So, I mean, I would still consider myself a moderate Muslim, but I'm, you know, a lot more practicing than I used to be. You know, and it's interesting because I met and married a convert, you know, and she's, you know, as converts tend to be, is much more knowledgeable about my faith than I am as a born Muslim. And so her and I have, you know, really explored our faith together. And as far as a little bit closer, having a child again, obviously makes you think about it more as well, which her and I both have since having our daughter, and thinking about how we want to convey our religious and faith beliefs to her, and you know, practice all the customs and teach her all of the rituals, and make sure that she at least has exposure to it, so that at some time in her life she can make those decisions as well.
Right.
So
let me ask you a question just
sure.
when you say that.
I'm asking the questions here. No,
Sorry.
no, go ahead.
When you use the phrase moderate Muslim,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously, for a lot of people that are watching who may not be looking at this from a faith perspective, they're thinking that means you don't plant IEDs in Afghanistan or something, you know. I mean, but from coming at from a faith perspective, would you say there are any important decisions that you make in your day-to-day life where you don't think, at least when you're sussing out the options, that you don't think about what God's opinion of that would be?
I'm more and more conscious of it. You know, we have a lot of phrases in Arabic, you know, from the Quran that we use throughout our day, right? You know, whether it's inshallah, you know, by God's will, or mashallah, by the grace of God, or alhamdulillah, or subhanallah. Like, these are all things that we say and use when we're appreciative of what we've had, to show our gratitude, or to recognize that, you know, what we've been given is all by the grace of God. You know,
Yeah.
and I find myself thinking those things more often than I used to, right, in my own way of appreciating, you know, what I have and what I've been blessed with, which I never did before. So
Right.
that part of it, I think, is the part that makes me the practicing Muslim that I wasn't before. You know, I don't as much get concerned about like the prohibitive stuff, right? Like, oh, don't drink alcohol and these kinds of things. I mean, I used to drink, I don't now. That's more of a health decision for me than it ever was a faith-based decision. I don't really, you know, but some of the other, you know, tenets that we have, you know, we have the 5 pillars of Islam, one of which is praying 5 times a day. So I don't pray 5 times a day. You know, I'm lucky if I get Friday prayer in every week, which I try to make a habit of doing. But other than that, you know, other than during Ramadan, which I may, you know, strive to pray more during the day, you know, I'm not a 5 times a day kind of prayer, which, you know, person who's taking that time to pray 5 times a day, I would consider them to be much more devout than myself. You know, that's just how I measure it. People would measure those
Right.
things differently. Is that what you're trying to?
Yeah, to some extent. I think you know, there's the practical and public part of religious faith that I think is there to help us get to a place where we're oriented towards God constantly, but they're not the end, they're the means. And there are alternative means, I think. You know, in Christianity, there's, you know, you can be the showy Christian, you can be at Bible study Tuesday and Thursday, and morning prayer on this day, and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And that's, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but at the end of the day, the call in Christianity is to be praying incessantly. Essentially, your life becomes a prayer, and trying to infuse that orientation, that having your direction always set towards the Almighty in all your daily actions. And I think that can be achieved in a lot of different ways. And that's why I'm challenging your use of the word moderate, because I'm not sure, any instances I've been dealing with you, I get this strong feeling that you're weighing your values towards that standard on a constant and ongoing basis. So I would say you're a radical Muslim.
Thanks,
in the
Robert.
good way.
Thanks for putting that on video.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, like I said, I mean, we all, you know, look at the religious spectrum differently, you know, whether we're looking at it for ourselves or for others, right? So that's very interesting that you see it that way. And I totally get where you're coming from. You know, it's funny because during Ramadan, I'm, you know, for sure, at least one or twice during Ramadan, somebody will say to me, "Oh, Najib, I didn't know you were so religious," right? Because they know that I'm fasting, right? And I've always thought that that was very interesting because they see me in a different light than they normally thought of me, right? Because, you know, for whatever reason, they didn't think of me as either a person of faith or, you know,
Right.
a devout Muslim. But because now that I'm fasting and I didn't want a drink of water or join them for lunch, they kind of get it. So, you know, my response has always been, well, you know, I don't think of myself as religious. I think of myself as being a man of faith. And to me, the difference is that, to me, religion is all those rituals. Like the religion is the, you know, praying 5 times a day, and all the other religion or all the other rituals that are asked of us, right? To me, faith is the other part, right? Faith is the part of, like, I just believe in something greater than myself, you know, whether if for someone else, they imagine that to be a, you know, old white man on a cloud with a big beard looking down on us, that's fine for them, but that's not how I look at it. You know, I think that there's things that are bigger than ourselves, and I've seen it demonstrated throughout my life. I think that it's very important to remember that, you know, the blessings that you have, whether they're small or large, and be grateful for those things because they can be taken away from you. And it also allows you to be appreciative of what others do not have, when you do appreciate the little that you have daily, and as it's being given to you or revealed to you. So to me, that's how I see it, right? Like, to me, like, that's what being a man of faith is about. And the reason why Ramadan is so important to me and so important to many Muslims is because it is during that 1 month that is our entire focus. Our entire focus during the month of Ramadan is not, you know, to diet as an intermittent fasting diet. Our requirement is for a few days to experience what it might be like to go without for other people, right? To not be able to eat and drink as much as you want to.
And also to have a continual reminder of what your true focus is, what your true north is.
Yeah, and absolutely. And it never fails, right? I mean, I always, you know, experience it. I mean, this is the 9th fast and tomorrow's the 10th. And it's usually, you know, the first few days I'm okay, right? Because, you know, you've got calories and energy stored up. You know, day 3, 4, 5 gets really, really tough. But then towards the 10th day, and Ramadan's broken out into 10 days, you know, there's 10 days of mercy, it's broken down into thirds, right? So, and I think that's actually quite ingenious because it's around the 10th day when you feel enough depleted in terms of your energy that now you start to get singularly focused, right? Because now you only have a certain amount of energy and effort in you. So you start to like focus on those things and reflect on things that matter to you. So it's a very interesting process as you go through the thirds throughout the month. And that's why I think it's so important to people, right? It's not just about the outward community and customs and the gatherings and the prayers and all that, but it's also about what it does to you internally and how it sort of focuses you spiritually.
Right.
Like the saying I always put up every year is that, we starve our bodies to feed our souls.
Right.
So this, in that context, this Ramadan's very interesting for us, for most of us in our lives. We've never experienced a Ramadan where, so, we get up during Ramadan before sunrise and we eat a meal and we pray, and then, there's prayers throughout the day. Usually the mosques are very busy during Ramadan because people are making every effort. Men who are obliged to, women, aren't obliged to go to the mosque for prayer, but men are. And, we all make more of an effort to go and pray in the mosque in congregation rather than, individually. So the mosques tend to be busier. Friday, usually at capacity at every mosque in the city, or Friday prayer. And then, so there's that. Then there's nighttime prayer. So after you open your fast at sunset, we go for Taraweeh or Tarawih prayers at night. Can't do that in congregation either. So a lot of that is being done streamed online and people following along and that sort of thing. So, it's taken away that community, that togetherness that we're used to experiencing. Iftars, which is the breaking of the fast at sunset, is a big deal, right? You try to do it with others. You try to have people over. You've taken part in some of our meals during Ramadan where we, try to meet other people and new people and break bread together. That's a big part of it, which we can no longer do. So, I've broken every one of my fasts, basically by myself this year because my wife's not fasting. My daughter's not obliged to fast. Obviously, she's too young. So I've broken them, by myself, which is a whole different experience as well, right? Because, sunset is at 9 p.m. My daughter and my wife have eaten at 6 p.m. or 6 p.m. My daughter's gone to bed by the time that I eat. So it's very solitary, but, my wife has, gone to great extremes to prepare nice meals for me. But it's an interesting experience to do that on your own and, put sustenance in your body and reflect on it. There's no distraction, right? Every bite you consume is meaningful.
Right. Do you find it's different, but maybe some of it different in a good way, in that you're celebrating the relationship to the Almighty even more definitively than when you're celebrating also the community relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people, what I've seen, are experiencing that, right? Is they're experiencing it on a different level because now there's no distractions, right? How much of your time did you spend before getting ready to, go to the mosque or getting ready with friends and preparing elaborate meals, and all of that takes time away from the spiritual reflection, right? And now, a lot more of our time is being allocated to just that piece of it, solitary reflection on however people choose it, whether you choose to read the Quran or pray or just sit in silence and think, there's a lot more time and less distraction now.
Yeah. Well, from a Christian perspective, I mean, we share your pain in the sense that, Easter is the most significant calendar day in the Christian year, and celebrating the, death and resurrection of Christ. And likewise, it's, very unusual for practitioners of the Christian faith not to be in community on that day. Even the most, even my dad used to come on Easter Sunday when, Christmas and Easter is kind of the obligatory, token Christian days to show up. And, packed churches, fancy services, big meal afterwards, that kind of thing. And it was very different this year, and hard to make that adjustment. The other, most of the community that I'm circulating in has responded quite well to, responsibly and effectively, I would say, to the constraints put upon us by the pandemic. Responsibly in that I don't know anyone personally who's been encouraged to go to a large gathering. You know, I think those situations down in the States are somewhat, you know, isolated cases, let's call it. And I suspect if you looked closely at those communities, there's probably things that someone like myself and many of the people I worship with would have problems with worshiping there just on a day-to-day basis in terms of their theology and stuff. It's almost you know, we dare you virus kind of an approach to it's not viewing the virus as part of God's creation and something that we're being invited to share the experience of and respond to as a community. It's something that they're fighting against. You know, it's a war mentality to faith.
And it's also like, you know, this belief that we should somehow, you know, test our faith and test God by exposing ourselves to this virus, right? Like,
Right.
You know, we shouldn't hide from it. We need to like take it head on, and our faith will save us, right? Or if we're meant to be saved, then God will save us. You know, it's that kind of that mentality and attitude, which doesn't really align with the real teachings, I don't think, of either of our faiths. I mean, we have in Islam, you know, there's a saying that you shouldn't even go to the mosque if you think your breath stinks, because you'll offend others, right? Never mind if you might be, you know, carrying a deadly virus that you're going to infect others with, right?
Right. Well, and certainly you know, in when Christ began his ministry, he started with 40 days of prayer and fasting in the desert, at the conclusion of which he's, you know, the scriptures report that he was tempted by Satan. And the last of those I don't know, actually, I'm not the best Bible guy, but one of those temptations, I'm not sure if it was the last one. I think it was the second or third one. But anyway, there were some great temptations. One was to turn a stone into bread to quench his hunger. But another was to cast himself down off a cliff, because God would send a fleet of angels to prevent him from even striking his toe on the ground. And while that may be true, you know, Christ responds with, you know, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. And while I think it's, you know, heroic to be a first responder, for example, on the front lines, I've got a good friend who's a Muslim ICU doc in Montreal. And I mean, he's going to work, and his faith allows him to believe that he'll be protected to the best, you know, but he's not going to leave his mask off, you know, to challenge God. He's going to use full PPE, and he's going to go in there and face danger intentionally in service of others. And that's completely different than artificially going in to, you know, experience a music song fest and throw a few coins in the plate, but challenging God to keep the virus out of that room. I mean, that's just a different thing. But
there's also, you know, also, and I think, you know, for people of faith, they realize that the pandemic is also from God, right? The pandemic is also, you have to believe in somehow, you know, in his infinite, his or hers, depending on how you believe, infinite wisdom. This is another challenge or test or something that he's done but that is the best, in the end, might be the best for us. And, you know, and also too, you know, all of the things that we've been given to get through it, it's from God as well, right? Technology is also, if you believe in it, is also in some ways from God as well, right? So the ability that we're able to still connect with each other and make long distance phone calls and have video conferencing and have online worship is also still something that we've been granted and given.
True. And but I think it's also important in respect of those who've, I mean, you and I have been fortunate. We've been inconvenienced. We haven't been. We're not suffering.
No.
You know, we have food. We have shelter. We're not single people, so we're not even really that lonely. You know, I mean, I'm suffering a little more than you, because my wife's in Halifax looking after her parents for 2 or 3 months. But I got nephews and a son here in the house to help me go crazy together. But you know, anyway, there are people who are suffering more significantly, losses of loved ones, suffering with illness, suffering with, you know, real mental health issues that are come out of this, as I'm sure you're hearing about in your debriefs with your psychologist spouse. You know, there's a lot of people who are and we have to be careful, I think, about it. Everything does come from God, but it's not necessarily specifically or directly God's will, in the sense that in the sense of pushing the button that says the pandemic button on the divine computer. At least that's not the way my theology sort of leads me. It's more of a, there's an important relationship here between God and his creation, and we're a free will part of that. And, in the same way that, in the same way that, mass murder in Nova Scotia or downed helicopters in the Mediterranean, or wars or whatever, aren't necessarily something that God wants for us. They're within the realm of our free choice to influence and bring about. And, we don't know exactly what causes pandemic, but maybe bats in food markets aren't a great idea. But at the end of the day, you're right. It is how we respond to the challenges that come to us is an opportunity to deepen our relationship with God, and we either rise to that challenge or cower in the face of it, and that's true of most challenges in life. But I was going to share also, since you were mentioning Ramadan, the other big difference. So our church is running an online service, for example. Actually, I've been sort of quasi-attending both our former parish and our current parish. One is elected to do Facebook Live, where it's streaming, and you can see the little names of all the other people who are there. And the other has done basically a prepared, coordinated sort of video load that they've prepared during the week, which is a combination of music, readings, sermon, this sort of thing, all the things that would normally be part of our service. And then they patch it all together and post it as a integrated unit, so you can join in. But it's not live. It's so you've got an interesting trade-off there between the sense of community that you get from seeing the other people pushing the like button on a Facebook live stream, versus but a little more susceptible to technical glitches and interruptions in internet, and it's much less polished. And then on the other hand, you've got this fairly polished, slick service, but not quite as intimate, that in the sense that unless you get on Zoom and watch it together with a couple of other families in your parish, you're kind of doing it in an isolated fashion. So that's been one thing that I've observed is interesting to see the different ways that different faith communities have risen to the challenge of giving their members an opportunity to keep in touch with their faith. But then the other big thing is, of course, you can't, in the same way that your Friday prayers are an important part of your sort of a touchstone in that community where you're all doing the same thing at the same time in the same place, the Eucharist or the communion is a big part of our weekly practice. It's not all churches practice it weekly, but the parish that we go to does. And that's you can't do that over the internet. It doesn't work. You can't have the bread and wine and share in the sort of sacrifice of Christ, and that is a surprising, tangible touchstone. I mean, I know there's different theological views within different main churches. The Catholics have one theological prospect or outlook or perspective on what actually transpires during the Eucharist, but I think pretty much all Christians ascribe an importance to it that is somewhat supernatural, if you will, and to have that missing is a real tangible loss. And I'll look forward to my first communion after the pandemic, or after the general lockdown is lifted, will be a joyous occasion.
Yeah, and it's, I think you and I are on the same page, and our faiths are on the same page about the free will aspect of it, is that, even though everything, it might be of God's plan, then, we also have to make the right decisions, and we also suffer the consequences of the wrong decisions as well, right? So, but let's examine that a little bit, So do you feel overall in Canada and Alberta that in your faith community that people are dealing with it quite well? They're respecting the and understanding the restrictions and the lockdowns and staying away from places of worship. Is there any examples of, you know, communities that aren't doing that, that you know of, that are insisting that they still have to go, and what is their position on that?
I don't think I've seen anything in Canada, and I'm consuming the same media as you. I certainly don't know of anything firsthand, you know, and there's been a few examples out of the U.S. There's some big cultural differences that are really brought into broad daylight between Canada and the U.S. that they're always there, and we always sort of see them a little bit, but that sort of independent streak that runs through the American culture is more prominent today. You know, you got, when we do the protest, for example, to end the lockdown and stuff, to get back to the hair salons, you know, which is it boggles the mind that that's the most important thing people could come up with to tell the cameraman when they're out protesting a lockdown that's, you know, presented as a way to save their neighbors' lives. But anyway, you know, that independent streak is runs deeper and more passionate in the U.S., and that shows up in some of these religious communities that are
Is it about that though, you know, Robert? I don't know if it's so much about, I mean, we are, I think, just as individualistic and independent in Canada. I just think that the levers are used differently in the US, right? I think that especially for the evangelical Christian right, you know, their leaders and the political leaders use the faith, I think, in a different way than it's used here in order to get across whatever political point they want to get across. I think that some of it is actually organized, you know, when we see these protests of going back to church or going back to the hair salon in order to reinforce the decisions that the politician actually wants to make, right? So, oh, look at all these people protesting. I have to open up again. I have to let people go back to faith. And, you know, that's done top down from elected officials to religious leaders to, you know, the congregation and the community, right, is to organize them and to show this force that, you know, I have no choice, I have to make these decisions. So it's always amazing to me that it happens in all the areas where, you know, the governor or the mayor or, you know, whatever state official wants to get across a certain message, right? You know, one day he's talking about, you know, he wants to, you know, ease the restrictions and open up the economy. The next day people are protesting for the same thing, right? So I was a bit cynical about that. The other thing that I think, you know, is worth looking at in that, you know, Southern Bible Belt and evangelical movement in the States is like this idea of the prophet gospel, right? The profiteering gospel, right? Like, you know, give us your
prosperity gospel.
The prosperity, yes, that's it. Thanks. The prosperity gospel, right? Is like, you know, give us your assistance check. You know, give us your money that you're getting.
Plant your seed and God will return tenfold.
God will return tenfold. And, you know, I have to have a jet. How am I supposed to, you know, get to all my important meetings? And,
right.
You know, I think that a lot of it drives that as well, right? Is because let's face it, I mean, even here, our places of worship are suffering, right? Because when we don't attend, you know, we don't donate as much or as freely as, you know, when we're actually there. You know, we have, you know, a big consideration this Ramadan is zakat, you know, our giving of charity, our obligatory giving of charity, you know, that I think, I mean, obviously we will all still figure out how to give that online or through mail. But, you know, being at, you know, in person at a mosque and having the donation box there, you know, is a big difference. And you know, a lot of our mosques are hurting from not having that, that regular attendance, as you know, our nonprofits and other community service organizations. So, you know, I think that's a real thing, right? Where, you know, the people who organize and run our places of worship have real concerns.
Yeah, and it could be that you know, I always try and take a charitable view of somebody's motives when I don't see into their heart, which I never do. But, you know, it's not impossible to imagine that a televangelist style pastor with a mega church in the States doesn't have at least one eye on the receipt column when he's advocating a return to the church and making his decision as to how to lead his flock, so to speak. Interesting enough, I haven't looked recently, but about 2 weeks ago, our church was actually maintaining their pace of giving. So for whatever reason, I think we obviously, where possible, try and encourage people to participate in pre-authorized giving, sort of disciplined giving where it's an automatic withdrawal and stuff. So that obviously continues unless somebody's lost a job or something where they might have to alter their pace of giving. But at the end of March, which was 2 or 3 weeks into not having services, we were actually sort of on a flat. Now I know that's not the case for a lot of charitable organizations, but I wonder how much of that is because there's less to give from as opposed to less will to give, because there's certainly a lot of people who have lost income that can, if they're tithing and giving their 10% off the top, there's less, that's 10% of the 2,000 that Justin sent them, not anything else, because for a lot of people that's all they're earning right now.
That's a very good point. Our ability to give is diminished as well, right? Financially diminished. So, let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, I think you're right in the sense that, I'm especially seeing in our community, our mosques have had to, the ones that were behind with technology in terms of using the internet and online ways of raising money have now had to embrace it. I've seen some amazing initiatives in terms of online fundraising, online events that are held to raise money. So I think that that's actually a good thing. I mean, this isn't new, right? I mean, always, churches, mosques, and faith communities are slow to embrace technological advances. But I always remember I went to church with a friend of mine, way back, and they had just gotten the screen, for singing songs.
Yeah.
What's it called?
Putting the words on the screen.
Yeah, so that everybody can sing together. And then there's this little ball, little karaoke ball that went, from word to word. And I'll never forget. She's like, "Yeah, we call that the Jesus ball." Because the kids the young people found it so interesting that they were just getting this, whereas
right.
The rest of the world had PowerPoint and this stuff for forever. But I always thought that was an amusing anecdote. But yeah, it's I think it's a good thing because I think that our mosques and churches and places of worships were really behind, and as our older generation baby boomers die off or become restricted in terms of retirement and the funds that they have, they weren't doing a good job of outreach to Generation X and younger in terms of being able to access us and for giving, because we're not as likely to want to attend some physical fundraiser. We want to have other ways of being communicated to and asked of in terms of giving. So I think that this is gonna jumpstart that and force those institutions to embrace different ways of approaching raising funds and connecting with the community.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because it's an interesting time to be in a position of leadership, and the situation with the pastors down in the States and maybe some of the political leaders down in the States is maybe one of the examples that will go down in history as a how not to lead. But when we were talking about some of the differences between Canada and the US, I would say that there's a pretty dramatic difference in the approach to leadership here. And I've been impressed with almost everyone, almost all the time. Not 100%, but 90% of the people, 90% of the time, I've been impressed with the way they've chosen to be responsible and provide leadership in the sense of calling out the best in people to act in a certain way in the good interests of the entire society. Whereas there's some pretty glaring examples, like we've been talking specifically about churches that have maybe been leading their flock in some dangerous and irresponsible ways, but lots of great, not so pleasant examples of leadership in the States that are, I don't know, they're going to be interesting. I'm sure they'll be studied in leadership and poli-sci classes for decades to come.
Yeah, and when I try to, get to the root of that, or when I think about, what's spurring that, what's behind that, and to me, it seems to always come back to either a political motive or, a financial motive, right? I can't, because like I said, you'd be hard pressed to find in either of our faiths, any scripture that says, you must attend church. Actually, for us, the whole world is our place of prayer. Right? We're told that way. We should pray wherever and whenever we need to. Right? You don't have to be in the confines of a mosque to have your prayer recognized. Right? Obviously, praying in convention has that additional connection and benefit, but it's pretty explicitly told to us that the whole world and any place that we can safely pray is a place of prayer. So I don't think it's, I find it hard pressed that it's driven by the congregation, that this need to actually go to the church. What would be spurring that? Like, why would any person of faith, other than the fact that they might have a ritual or habit, feel like they have to go to church?
Well, I mean, from a Christian perspective, there are definite edicts or guidances from Christ to pray together. Not only, but that's in some tangible, real world way that common prayer is different than singular prayer. There's times when Christ talks about, and I hope I'm not butchering my attributions here, but where there's, praying for self-aggrandizement in a public square is not something that's encouraged, and the opposite of that is described as go and pray quietly in a closed, behind a closed door, and your prayers will be heard by God, rather than in the public square where it'll just be for the benefit of the others who will see you praying. So in that sense, there is an importance to quiet individual prayer, but there is also the, when two or more of you are gathered together in my name verse, which is, Christ's clear injunction to make sure we also get together and pray. Now, can that be done virtually? I'm sure it can. At the end of the day, it's God's not inside the walls of the building. So, and two or more is pretty easy, unless you live by yourself in a house. Two or more can just be with your spouse or your kids, or a neighbor over the phone or whatever. So there's lots of ways to respect that. But I think that's what probably gets used to justify some of this misbehavior, if you will. But at the end of the day, like most things, it's not the letter, it's the intent of how you're following laws that's the more important and harder to discern. And when you were describing some of the mechanisms before, it sounded a little bit like deep state conspiring with deep church, in the sense of trying to achieve political ends. And there's possibly a little bit of that. Certainly there are alignments, particularly in the United States, between political parties and portions of the Christian religious community that where they have shared objectives, and I'm not quite sure how they decide which things they throw out and which things they consider so important that they'll elect Donald Trump or something, but that's clearly part of their thought process. It is a faith-driven voting decision, which is a little discouraging to think of in terms of where did all the 350 references to the poor that Jesus made, and I'm making that number up, but I know it's a lot. Where did that suddenly get superseded by, but we can get a Supreme Court justice who will prohibit choices for abortion? But that clearly is part of the process that happens down there. So
no, but I mean, it's a reality, Robert. I mean, the fact that we think that there's a separation between church and state, either in the U.S. or in Canada, is a farce, right? We've seen it even here in the UCP election and nominations, in our last provincial election, right? We had candidates that were backed by faith institutions solely based on a survey that they filled out and their position on pro-life. and they managed to get their candidates nominated and elected solely based on that, right? So,
Sure.
I don't think that we should disillusion ourselves that somehow, that doesn't happen. It happens, I'm telling you, and it's happened in every country that I've been involved in politics, in places
Well, and I
like,
would argue it should happen. I mean, people of faith should vote for a government that reflects the values that they believe in. At the end of the day, we all, in some fashion or other, do that, whether it's the keep your hands out of my pocket, small government mindset, or the we can do more if we work together mindset. If you're true to yourself and understand and reflect on your own personal values, casting your vote in a way that will lead to a government that will help nudge society towards a reflection of those values is a positive thing. So I don't think that's necessarily inherently a bad situation.
Except when it's twisted for political gain, right? Like, so, for example, it's a very different conversation if I'm casting my vote based on my faith values or any types of values. That's a much different decision. But manipulating a community, a faith-based community, to think that a certain candidate or elected official is aligned with their faith based on a singular objective, like pro-life, for example,
right,
is a very twisted and manipulative way of communicating that, right? So let's disregard everything else the man stands for, but because he said that he's pro-life, we all got to get behind him, which is a lot of the justifications you see with people who defend Trump, right? Faith-based communities who defend Trump, right? It's based on, let's ignore all of his other faults, but because of this one thing that he believes that we believe, we're going to stand behind him come hell or high water.
Yeah, well, and the irony being that he doesn't even necessarily believe it. I'm not sure there's a
absolutely, and that's where the
belief there. It's just he's willing to vote or act in accordance with our belief in order to co-opt our support. So
and that's where the transparency has to come in. I have no issue, and I absolutely agree with you that our religious organizations, our religious institutions, our faith-based communities should be involved in politics, and we should be heavily involved, and we should make sure our values are reflected in the parties and candidates that we give our money to and votes to. But it needs to be transparent, Robert, and that's what it isn't. It isn't transparent to us in how we're being manipulated and coached and pushed towards a certain party or faith by our religious institutions and their leaders.
Well, and in terms of the political candidates, it's a reflection of a loss of the importance of the word leadership. In terms of you would aspire to have candidates and leaders who actually believe in leading towards something, and in other words, bringing the populace towards a value set that they think is going to advance the betterment of society as a whole, and explaining why they think that's going to advance the betterment of society, and inspiring people to get on board with that, as opposed to, the current mantra in a lot of politics is, find a micro group, poll to find out, or focus group to find out what hot button they'll be animated by and give their $20 to, and then feed them in a selective ad campaign something that will trigger clicks and donates. And it may be the current mode, but it's not leadership. It's more followship, because you're looking for the thing to then let your policy platform or your pseudo policy platform be guided by what you see as the popular thing in this small segment.
Yeah, and also too, partisanship is a huge issue, right? And that's also not transparent, right? And we have to remember, Robert, that a lot of people who are not politically engaged do look to the leaders in their faith communities and other people for guidance, right, in terms of who and how to vote, right? So when those people are partisan towards, whether it's a party or a certain political objective, that's not transparent. That's not communicated to the congregation. That's not communicated to the citizens, right? We're just, it's sort of masked in different ways. And I've been part of these, initiatives in almost every election when, a certain mosque or a certain organization, in the community decides that they're going to back a certain party or a certain candidate, and but isn't transparent to the community of why that is, right? I mean, there's
Right.
and that's what I have an issue with, is that that's an injustice, right? That's an injustice to manipulate how somebody of faith is going to vote based on what your political objectives are, right? And I see that time and time again.
Well,
And it's easily done, in countries like Pakistan, where the literacy rate is really low,
yeah.
and I've seen it done, where basically what's happened is the political party will get money to the right religious leaders in a village or a town, and then they'll come with buses, and and people are all directed to get on the bus and told, they have in Pakistan, because of literacy, every party has a symbol next to it, right? Because people can't read, so they're just told to look for the symbol, right, and check it off, right?
Yeah.
And they're given, a bag of flour, or 100 rupees, or whatever, to get them to do that, right? And it's not to that degree here in the West, but the manipulation of faith-based communities is to the same degree. The objectives are the same.
Sure. Well, and it's interesting because there's been this rise of populism over the last, what is it, I guess 20 years probably, I don't know, 10, 20 years. But one thing that I was struck by, contrasting, like, I probably disagree with as many or more of Rob Ford's policy initiatives as Premier of Ontario than I do with a lot of Donald Trump's policy initiatives as President of the United States. And they both certainly present themselves as populist candidates, or the analysts would say they're both populists. And yet I've been truly impressed by Rob Ford. I got the right Ford? Yeah. Yes.
Oh, sorry. No, Doug Ford.
Is it Doug now? Yeah, Rob was his brother. Sorry about that. Anyway, so I've been truly impressed because the one thing that's painstakingly clear is he genuinely feels the pain of the average person that's suffering in this crisis. He's either a true populist or he's the world's best actor, because it comes across in every press conference. He's working his butt off to be, and he is trying to lead people to a positive place, and he's relying on the guidance of his medical advisors and stuff like that. Whereas it's equally painfully clear that Donald Trump is got an agenda to every single comment that he makes, and it has very, very little to do with the best interests of the everyday man. Now, at the end of the day, they'll both probably, after this is all over, lower taxes to corporations and rich people, and because they think that's the way to to whatever end they're pursuing. But it's interesting to see the difference between what I would call a true populist and a pseudo-populist.
No, or the other thing is they know how to read polls, and there's shrewd politicians, right? So in the case of Doug Ford, he ran on For the People platform, and he by all accounts he's living up to that. And my optimistic side says yeah, he saw an opportunity to actually show that he does care about people and show his compassion, and without the restraints that he normally would have from his party, and he can now freely do what's right for the citizens, because it's polling really well and his approval ratings are really high. The cynical side of me says that he's doing what he's doing because it's polling really well and his approval ratings are really high. It's amazing to me that, or it's coincidental to me that the premiers that want to continue the lockdown and are a little bit hesitant to open things up are the ones who are performing really well in the polls and approval ratings, and the ones who are more eager to get back to things as normal are the ones that aren't, including our prime minister, are the ones who are in a hurry to lift the restrictions. Our prime minister on the other side wanting to extend it as long as possible because of his approval rating. So
right.
At the end of the day, and I don't fault them for that. Listen, at the end of the day, just like anything else, I mean, they're worried about getting reelected. They're worried about accomplishing their mandates. They also have the real concern of financial concern and the economy collapsing, right? And how to get all those things fixed. Because, problem is that voters and people have short memories. So a year from now, when we're sitting on giant debts and we're being asked to pay more taxes, and no one's going to remember the $2,000 check. You know what I mean? So they're all conscious of that as well, right? Is that how they performed during this time may not be remembered, and they only might be remembered by what the outcomes were at the end of the day. So if that outcome is a giant debt, then they're gonna have a hard time overcoming that. So I don't fault them on any of that. I do question this idea of the great leaders in some of the countries that have kept the cases of infection down and the death rates down versus because I don't think that we truly understand the on-the-ground realities in those different countries, the cultural realities, the population densities, the socioeconomic, the many things, right, that can keep different leaders in different countries from accomplishing the same objectives we're trying to accomplish here. So I think that some of that finger pointing that's going on, I have an issue with. Which is why I am, like I said, doing this series where I'm actually interviewing people on the ground in different countries and trying to get their perspective. Going back to the faith thing, so what do you think? How do you think that we can overcome some of the issues in terms of fundraising for within our communities? I find it interesting because I know there must be something similar in Christianity as well, but we have a hadith, words of the Prophet Muhammad that were recorded that he talks about the fact that when it comes to charity and good deeds, your left hand shouldn't know what your right hand is doing, meaning that you should be discreet in your giving. Now, obviously, there's also the idea that you don't want to be too discreet, because when people see you giving, it also encourages others to give. For example, for you guys passing up the plate, right? I mean, when you see the plate is getting full, you see other people are giving, so you want to give as well. And we have these fundraisers where people put up their hands and make donations, and and some people think it's ostentatious and showing, but I do understand that that encourages other people to give as well. But this whole idea of being discreet, I mean, now more than ever, we have this ability to discreetly give and to do good deeds without having to announce it in front of the whole community.
Right. Well, there's similar edicts and words of wisdom and stuff in our faith, but interesting you mentioned passing the plate, because I've been pre-authorized giving for I don't know how long, 10 or 15 years. So other than when I visit someone else's church, I can't remember the last time I actually put something into the plate. So, but it still feels a little weird to pass it by. And I do relate to what you're saying, is I feel like, am I being judged? But then immediately reminding myself, well, I don't really care, because the only true judge is God. But, it is an interesting feeling to be passing the plate by. And we still do take up a collection, even though probably half the parishioners are giving in some other, direct way that doesn't involve putting an envelope in the plate. But in terms of how we address it as a religious community, good question. I mean, I was, I've been trying to think intentionally over the last, 6 weeks now, of little practices that can make big differences. And, so I've been calling them my COVID conventions. And, just small things like we try and have every day, we try and have one meal together in the house each day. And we try and recite one thing we accomplished and one thing we're grateful for in the day. It's hit and miss now that we're 6 weeks into it, because the low-hanging fruit has all been plucked, but we're still trying to do it. And it's just a way of, in a weird time, trying to keep a healthy mental attitude on things. And I was struck a few weeks ago by one of my clients gave a large donation to the Boys and Girls Club of Canada, an extra donation. They're a regular supporter, but they gave an extra donation because they knew they were under stress during this particular time, and blah, blah, blah. And I was applauding that, but then I decided that my next COVID convention should be, even if you're somewhat lighter in the pocketbook nowadays, these organizations really need to hear from you. And even if you're just going to give 20 bucks, which I think is the minimum deductible donation, my challenge to people on LinkedIn and Facebook was take 5 charities that you can't afford to give to right now and give them 20 bucks each and just let them know you wish you could do more, but you still support them and you're still in their corner, and you hope you get your job back or your income starts flowing again and that you'll be able to resume your regular support sometime. And in the meantime, give them a thumbs up, because the hardest part probably in those organizations is the sound of crickets, where they're wondering if anyone's still out there.
No, you're absolutely right, and you're right, and I saw your post on that, and I think that's a great way. We have some different ways that we're also doing that in our community, whether it's through giving or providing meals. We're doing iftar from afar, where you just try to find somebody and leave a package on their doorstep. Leave a meal on their doorstep, or the meal that you would usually invite people over for, you give that to the needy. So
Yeah.
there's all kinds of great initiatives. How do you? I'm still processing this because it just happened recently in Edmonton, but it's been unrolling across the country, where municipalities are giving mosques the ability to sound the azan, the call to prayer,
Oh, really?
at iftar time in the evening. And obviously, it wouldn't normally be done because you wouldn't allow it under noise bylaws and public nuisance bylaws and things like that. But now a lot of municipalities, and including Edmonton, have now allowed the mosques to sound the azan outside of the mosque, so that the community would be able to hear. Now, this is very common in Muslim countries. I mean, one of the things that I loved when I lived in Muslim countries, that I would hear the call to prayer 3, 4, 5 times at the same prayer time, because each of the mosques in the vicinity would take their turn announcing it. So for Muslims, it's a beautiful thing, right? Because we hear it, and obviously we can't go to the mosque, but it's a way of it's another touchstone, as you put it, with the community, right? And that recognition that obviously this is only for the month of Ramadan. But one of the things that's kind of nagging at the back of my mind is that how does this make other faith-based communities feel, right? Because what's so special about us, other than the fact that it's Ramadan, that we should get this special attention, when everybody has been locked out of their place of worship.
Yeah, but I don't think there's any. Most churches don't have steeples and bells anymore, but I'm pretty sure there's a couple in Edmonton that do, and they probably ring them at mass time on Sunday. I don't know, because I don't live near one that has a steeple and a bell, so it's not that much different, just not every day. But anyway.
No, I mean, it doesn't have to be apples to apples, but do you think that, and like it's too early to tell, and I haven't seen anything, but and obviously, I mean, the nature of faith-based communities is obviously we wouldn't belittle or begrudge other communities getting something like this, but it was just one of my concerns, was just that it doesn't have to be like the equivalent, but what can we do for other faith-based community in return to recognize the fact that we've gotten this special treatment and we appreciate it, and how can we reach out and make other faith-based community feel like something was done for them as well, right? I mean, I've always had an issue with communities only focusing on their own needs. I mean, I understand the need for advocacy for your own community, but I always feel like it should always be approached much broader. Like when we were advocating for this ability to sound the call to prayer, we should have also consulted with other communities and been like, okay, what can we also include for you while we're out there advocating on our behalf, right, for this thing? What can we do for the Jewish community, the Hindu community, the Sikh community, the Christian community? What little things can we help that might help you? And that's something I have an issue with, right? Because I just feel like it just further otherizes us, which is the last thing Muslims need right now.
Well, I'm sure in some people's mind that are, how should we say, aware enough to know what the noise is, but not aware enough to know that it's not the beginning of Sharia law in Canada. There'll be some people that will write a letter to the Journal or something probably, but I don't think it'll be a very large number, because there's probably the biggest demographic is the people who won't have a clue what the noise is. And then the second biggest will be the people who have an understanding that this is you know, a call to prayer, not an invasion call. So
Hey, listen, man, it's already Shrill. People are covering their faces. They're not going to
yeah,
bars. We're washing our hands 5 times a day. It's already come, Robert.
there you go.
There's another thing, that's really interesting, right? That I've seen a lot of writing on is, the fact that, the niqab ban, right, was a huge problem, right? We can't allow people to cover their faces. It's a security issue, right? It's amazing how little of a security issue it is now when it affects everybody.
Yeah. Well, Apple brought back the fingerprint sensor.
Yeah.
Crazy.
All right.
So here's a good question for you. What good are we called to bring out of this? What is the teachable moment in here that we can maybe push the societal dial a little bit in the God ordained direction? So that he's smiling at us after a year from now, when we've or maybe 2, when we've got this in our rearview mirror. I was listening to I actually looked to try and find it and couldn't, so I didn't save the post, obviously. And you know how it is on YouTube and Facebook posts. Once they're out of your immediate sight, they're gone forever. But I listened to about an hour discussion on, I think it was BBC, but it was between a couple of commentators and a hedge fund guru. But he was a very well-educated hedge fund guy. And he was talking about all the historical upheavals and all the changes they had led to, industrial revolution, Spanish flu pandemic, this kind of, and all, how there had been big changes that had come out of all these major upheavals. And that for the most part, they either led to horrible things like a war or something like that, because people were their worst selves and taking advantage of the weakened state of their neighbor or whatever and invading and this kind of thing. Or they tended to lead to good things, and it all boiled down to the positive changes, like more egalitarian, lower poverty rates, egalitarian sharing of wealth, this kind of thing. And so isn't that the real challenge that's before us right now, is how do we take the upheaval and the reset that we're in right now and help make it move the dial a notch or 2 towards the more positive outcomes?
Well, here's the thing, Robert, and here's what I think is going to happen. I think that if the lockdowns are lifted, in the fashion that they're being shown to us, in stages, and then basically looks like they're trying to look at getting things back to normal by July or so. Assuming that there's no reoccurrence or flare-ups again of cases and deaths. I think people are just going to forget. Like, you know what I mean? 3 months, 2 months is not enough time for people to significantly change their behavior, right? If it was, then we'd have a different world. So all of these things that people proclaim of a better world that's going to happen after the pandemic, I don't think it's going to happen. I think, the issue is that the systems that we have in place, the beholden parties and large corporations that we have, are counting on that. They're counting on us, once things are back to normal, to be so busy and overcome and overwhelmed by the challenges of trying to get our lives back in order that, we won't have time to pay attention to everything that was done or wasn't done by them. And, we'll be too worried about, as we were before, about our daily lives. I think that if there is significant impact for a longer term, I think it's more likely that there will be some serious changes. Just like now, how it's very easy now, all of a sudden, for governments who had no money before for public services, now all of a sudden have found the money. The longer that it goes on, the more that they can justify that, right? I don't think, for example, the passing of the assault rifles ban, I don't think that could have been done the way that it was done if it wasn't for the pandemic. I mean, the fact of the matter is that his approval ratings are so high that he can pretty much do anything right now, right? So it's the best time to do it, and that's why they did it now. I mean, other than because of what happened in Nova Scotia, but that's not the first time something like that's happened either, right? So that plays in it, right? So to me, it's like the longer it goes on for the leaders that are performing well to make, the right decisions for citizens, allows them to do that, right? But at the end of the day, they're all beholden to somebody, and they need to get reelected, and they need money, and they need votes, etc., and they have mandates to accomplish. So, once everything's lifted, that's going to be the main concern. So the bright side of it, I think it is going back to the faith perspective, is that I think that, for me especially, and again, like I said, I'm not a religious scholar, so I can only, talk to, my own beliefs and my own ways of practicing my faith, is that being very conscious. They have something in Islam, again, that, you should wear Islam like you wear a shirt. You know what I mean? It should be so comfortable that you shouldn't even know that it's there, right? Versus, like, we've gotten so caught up in, in our rituals and our practices that we forget that, right? That, the idea behind that is that it should just be in everything you do, and it should be natural, and you shouldn't be so worried about how other people are practicing your faith, and, who's, praying the right way and who isn't, who's giving the right way and who isn't, who's acting the right way and who isn't, and just focus on your faith. And I think this shedding and this inability of, to do those rituals, those outward facing rituals, those public rituals, I think frees us up and allows us to be truly more connected with our faith in other ways than just that outward showing of faith. I think that's one thing we can hold on to, and then also to recognizing that how easy it is to take the time to help others and to recognize the effort of others, and how little it actually takes when you're not so distracted by everything else that you have going in your life. My friend, gave me a little story that I thought was really, really poignant, right? He said that, he was playing in his front yard with his daughter, and for the first time in his neighborhood, cars would actually slow down and smile and wave to her, right? Now me, my memories as a child, when you played street hockey and stuff, that happened all the time. Like, people would stop and honk and laugh and, comment on what team and etc., right, when we're playing street hockey, right? But nowadays that doesn't happen anymore, right? Everybody's in such a rush. So I think that's slowing down and recognizing that sometimes, we do need to have time to appreciate ourselves and others. I think if we start focusing too much on systemic changes in, capitalism and redefining the way that, the electoral system functions, we're gonna, be severely disappointed. But if we focus on the small changes in behavior that we actually are in our control, I think that's where the power is. I think that's where the learning is, because through that, hopefully, there'll be enough of us that are focused on that we can action it in a way that will get us those systemic changes as well.
Well, and it's really, we've been talking about faith, but it's really faith drives values for us. But even for someone who's, agnostic or atheistic and doesn't have a higher being that defines their value system for them or helps shape it, they still have a value system. And at the end of the day, a lot of people, I think, are reconnecting in a tangible way with their core value systems or their worldview. My wife teaches at King's University, which is a small Christian university in Edmonton, and their perspective, and they welcome students of all faiths, and non-faiths, but their mandate to the students is everyone has a worldview, whether you are doing it intentionally or not. So let's be intentional about it and be informed when we create and mold and sculpt our worldview, so that we know what is shaping our views and our values and our activities and our directions and choices in the world. They're presenting the best aspects they can of the Christian worldview, but they're not saying that has to be your worldview. They're saying you just have to accept the fact that everyone has one, and you might as well be disciplined in how you shape yours. And so the real question is are people refining their worldview in this time? It was one of my favorite video clips was from Governor Cuomo. I don't know if you saw the one where he was talking about you know, how we're going to come out of this. And then he was saying, you know, I'm getting back to normal. And then he sort of launched into this very personal statement of how one thing that wasn't ever going to go back to normal was, you know, he was saying his relationships with his family are so different now that he's had a month of close interactions. Like he said, you know, he's got adult daughters that he's, for the last 10 or 15 years, he's been so busy and they've been busy, and it's like, hey, how you doing? Everything okay? Good, good. Oh, let's do dinner. Let's do coffee sometime. Okay, talk to you later. And he said, I haven't had a deep conversation with my daughters in a decade. And I said, I've had 10 of them in the last 6 weeks. And he said, I'm telling you right here, right now, that's not going back to normal. That is, I'm on a new normal now, because I value that. That's a good outcome of this crisis. And so if those values are tweaked and refined in a large number of people, then that does affect the way we look at, you know, the common enterprise that is society. So, you know, and there has, you know, if you look at the last 50 years, there's been a significant shift away from a we perspective to a me perspective. And it's been encouraged and rewarded and cultured by various you know, interests that are promoting it. But that's taken that me perspective has taken a real blow, I think, over the last 6 weeks. And the question is it a knockdown blow or not? It can't be a knockout, you know, it's not going to win the fight, but if it's a knockdown, it gives us a chance to position and gather our thoughts and prepare to push forward on that front. And that's, you know, that's maybe the silver lining in an event like this, because it's definitely, there's a lot of negative pushback on the "we're all in this together" mantra, because we're not all in it together the same way. There's lots of people who are suffering more than, for example, you and I are, but we are all in it together in the sense that there's no way to come out of it unless we all collaborate. If we have a 50% of the world that denies that we're in it together, we'll never be out of it until, you know, until herd immunity is achieved and 10 million people have died or 20 million people have died. So that's my hope and aspiration for this, is that we use it as an opportunity to refine and reaffirm our worldviews and value sets, and maybe push them forward a little bit, whether it's because of a God that we believe in, or just a sense of our role in society, a humanitarian perspective, and hopefully that maybe even shifts some of the attitudes of some of our leaders, and maybe they see the opportunity that, hey, wait a minute, I don't have to be a fellowship-based politician. I can actually get rewarded for being a leader, because there has been, you know, as you say, there's been polling results that have rewarded leaders for taking positive steps, not necessarily that are all 100% popular. So anyway, we'll see.
Well, you know, from your lips to God's ears, as they say.
Exactly.
Thanks for taking the time today, Robert. I really appreciate
it. Was fun.
Great conversation. Hope that, you know, when all of this is eased up, that we can all get together again. Always love connecting with you and Arlette. So looking forward to that.
When does Ramadan end?
It'll be around May 23rd, 24th.
You never know. I'm not optimistic, but maybe we'll break a fast together. Or if not, then there's always next year.
There's always next year, yeah.
Inshallah.
Thanks, inshallah. Thanks, Robert.
Okay, take care, man.
You too.